Alrighty, so let's begin to add in our first sort of more advanced material. We need the material for our landscape. Now, we could just drag in a grass material and add that in, but that's not going to look great. So I'm going to go to the My Stuffs folder, add in a material folder, and add in a new material and just call it m_landscape. Okay. Now I'm immediately going to create a material instance and call it mi_landscape. And I can apply this straight away to our material here. So I've got it selected in the content drawer. I've clicked on the material, I've clicked on the landscape, scroll down until we get where it says landscape material, and then use the use selected button. Now it's going to turn completely black and this weird shiny sort of material. Don't worry about that. That will change later on. Okay, so we're going to load up our material for our landscape to begin with. Now there's two different ways we can create or two main ways that we can create a material for a landscape. We can make it a paintable one, which means we can add in lots of different textures and then paint where we want them ourselves, or we can create what's called an auto landscape material. So both of them are very, very easy to do. Well, not very easy, but they're easy enough to understand. And the first node we're going to use, we're going to actually create the paintable version to begin with. So what we need first of all is called the landscape layer blend. Okay, and you get this little green node. Now to add in a paint, you need to have a layer for itself to go on. Okay, and that means we have to add in a array element here. You're basically telling it, I'm adding a new thing to paint with. So click this little plus button to add an element. We're going to click it twice because we're going to load up two different textures, and make sure you give them a name. So if it says layer none, that's not going to work. We need to give it a name. So click the drop down menus here, and under layer name, give it a name of whatever it's going to be. So I'm going to have grass and rocks. Okay. Now, if you're just going to plug in the sort of base color textures directly into here, no other information, that's absolutely fine. You could just hook that up to the base color, add in your two textures like so, and then you're done. Sure, but that's going to make a really boring texture. It's going to make it slightly glossy as well, because it's going to give the default value for your metallic and roughness, that sort of thing, which is 0.5, which is sort of a halfway for everything. So what we want to be able to do is actually sort of create our base color, roughness, normal, that sort of thing. So if we add in another node called get material attributes, you should see here we can add in array elements again. So we're going to click this 4 times. And if you don't see a menu come up here, you want to make sure you add in, open the drop down menu. And then you want to make sure that this says base color, then roughness, then normal, and then ambient occlusion. And you can hook this up to your material attribute node. Here we go, and connect the layer blend node as well. Don't worry about the error, it's just because we haven't fed anything in from the left hand side. Now what we can do is start to add in our textures. So I have previously downloaded some textures for this. So I'm just going to go to surfaces and I'm going to go to forest floor, add in these 3. So we're going to do one material at a time. I'm going to layer these like I layered them earlier. So base color, normal, and then the ORD. And to combine these, what we need to do is sort of create this material attribute tree and then plug that into the layer grass so that it can then spell it back out for it. So instead of get material attributes, we're going to set material attributes. And it's exactly the same process. We're going to come over to adding in an array element, click it 4 times, open up the drop down menu, but this time we're going to order it slightly differently. We're going to go base color, normal, ambient occlusion, and then roughness. And that's just because of the order that we have everything in over here. And then just like we did with the previous material for the walls, we can plug in base color, normal, ambient occlusion, and roughness using the RGB, R and G channels. Okay. Then when we plug this into the layer grass, you'll notice the error goes away and this turns bright white. Why does it do that? Well, because in the preview menu, we haven't told it what we want to paint with first of all. That's something we have to do in the landscape menu later on. So I'm just going to click save now so we don't lose any progress. And then we can do exactly the same thing for the rocks, just using the different textures. So I'm going to do Control D to duplicate our set material attributes node. And we're going to need to move down. So you may have seen me zooming in and out. That's just using the scroll wheel. And then to move around, it's right click. If you left click, it makes the selection box rather. So if you press right click and move around, then it sort of grabs onto wherever you are in the screen and allows you to move around a bit, if you're wondering how to do that. So now what I need to do is load in my rock textures. So exactly the same process. I'm going to drag these in, layer them in the order that I like to layer them in. And then we're all good to go. So plug that into base color, that into normal, the R into ambient occlusion, that into roughness, scroll up, and then plug that into layer rocks. Then click save. Now we could be done. We might not be, we could be, it's up to you. You could go back to your material and start painting with that. Go back to your landscape and start painting with that. But remember, we need to add in our tiling because the tiling could be wrong, we don't know. So better just to prepare beforehand. So press U and click or search for texture coordinate and your scalar parameter. So S and click or search for scalar parameter. Now we're going to want to make sure we name these appropriately. Remember, you can't have two parameters named the same thing. So we're going to call this one grass tiling. And then we're going to add this to a multiply node. Connect them like this. Set the default value to 1. Otherwise we'll have errors. And then plug this into UVs. And we can copy and paste this or press Control D again. Drag this down here. What have we forgotten? We've forgotten to rename the node here. So click on that, press F2, and then just rename it rock tiling. Okay, now we are good to go. So if I click save here, and then just minimize this, you should see we have our nice white environment. If we go to the landscape mode or Shift 2, and go to the paint menu, you should notice under the layers menu something appear. Now it hasn't appeared for me, and that is because I preloaded the material. So you just want to make sure that you, if this happens for you, just come back and reload that material. And sometimes it just takes a few minutes for it to load. There we go. So I just went back, reloaded it, and we're all good. Now, you can see here in this drop-down menu, it says none. We don't want it to say none, we want it to have a value. Now, what we want to do is to add something to the drop-down menu. So you can see here, I have previously created a grass texture. So we have a layer info for that, but it's not the right one for what we want. It's just one I used earlier. So we need to add in layer info for each of these layers before we can paint with them. So there's a little plus icon here. Click on that and bring in a weight blended layer. Doesn't really matter where it is saved to, so just click save and then close your content drawer. Do exactly the same thing with the rock layer, save, close your content drawer. Now when you click on rocks or grass, you can paint with rocks and grass. It will load up the first time, so don't worry about that too much. So what you can see here is I have got in a nicely blended sort of feathered brush so that it blends between the two textures, and it's put the grass absolutely everywhere. And it looks horrible because the tiling is so wrong. So this is where we can load up our material instance that we created earlier. Material instance, here we go. Just put this to one side and let's start with the grass. Click on that, and then we're going to start changing this down to be a smaller number. And you can see that it's starting to scale up. Now, in the early days of sort of playing around with materials with your landscapes, it's sometimes just better to make the material large for a landscape. And we can use what's called a MIP map later on to add in that texture for when you're up close to it. But I'm going to do that in a separate video at some point, okay? And so we've loaded up our sort of texture size for our grass, and this looks a lot better. And we could do the same thing with the rocks. So I'm just going to put 0.1. And when I click save, put the rocks in. There we go. We now have this rocky texture. Now, it looks a little bit sort of half and half at the moment because my tool strength is at 0.3. If I set it to 1, there we go. We now get the rock texture loaded up. Okay. Now, that could be the look you're going for. Personally, not the look I'm going for with this project, because what I want is a slightly more realistic looking landscape. And also, it's a little bit tedious to have to go through and find everywhere where I want rocks and go and paint them in like this on the side. It would be great if the computer just did it for me. And that's exactly what we're going to do. So I'm just going to change it so that there is no rocks anywhere, because that could mess us up later. There we go. And we're going to load up our material again. Now we can keep most of what is here already. In fact, we can just have to get rid of the layer blend. The rest of it's absolutely fine to keep, but we do need to change 1 or 2 bits. We'll probably end up getting rid of some of this tiling as well, just because it's not going to work too nicely with the new nodes that we're going to introduce. So to create what's called an auto landscape material, we need to use a node which is called a world aligned texture and a world aligned normal. Okay, so the way these work are they take textures and normal maps as well, and they apply them to where the landscape is, where they are in the world. And we can basically use this to get the computer to tell the material how steep a slope is, like a steeper gradient that the landscape might have. And then it will apply a material depending on how steep it is and blend it all for us. So what we can use these nodes for is to do it for us. But if I was to just try and attach this texture to the world aligned texture, you can see it's not compatible, and it's because we need this texture to be a texture object. Okay, so you just right click and click convert to texture object, and you can see it's been disconnected from the set material attributes node, and that's because we are now going to connect these to their corresponding world aligned nodes. And then using the XYZ texture, we can connect them back up to the base color. And then also we're going to need to put these in for the normal. Make sure you're using XYZ texture, not flat top. Otherwise you're going to encounter problems later on. So you can see there's something weird has sort of happened here because these aren't quite set to the... oh no, they are. It's all good. This should be set to a normal, and this should be set to color. But it says over here in sampler type anyway. Not really sure why it's done it weirdly there. But you can see that it's held on to these sort of tiling things, tiling connectors. That might not necessarily hold throughout the next stage. So what we're going to do now is add in the node that is going to combine these together, and that is called a matte layer blend underscore standard. So we want matte layer blend underscore standard, and you get this little blue node here which has 3 inputs and 1 output, and we actually can plug in the 1 output into this node here, the get material attributes node. Okay, and so what this does here is it combines 2 materials together, a top and a base material, and then combines them together using sort of a blend mode or a contrast in the alpha slot. So the alpha slot is connected to whatever the base material is. So for the materials that I'm using, we are only going to be using the grass for the top and the rocks for the bottom. So now what we can do is connect the material to top material, and we are now sort of halfway there, about a third of the way there. We can copy and paste these two nodes and bring them down to this node set and plug in our XYZ into base color and XYZ into normal. And don't forget to select the top two and right click, convert to texture object, set these to normal and color just in case it doesn't sort of follow through as well. And we can connect these up to texture. And then this one, this set material attributes, can go into base. Okay. And these will break their connection with the multiply in just a second. There we go. And there we go. So what we need to do now is add in the sort of contrast settings. How are they going to blend together? And the way we do this is using the world aligned normal. So what we're going to first of all create is a constant 3 or a color node. So if you press on that, and we actually need to double click on this and max out the blue slider, because what we're effectively telling it here, telling the node tree, is that we only want to use the Z values. So that's in sort of RGB terms. You can see here RGB corresponds to XYZ. So we need to tell the computer we only want to use the Z terms. And that is basically talking about the gradient of the slope. It's sort of the height change is what we wanted to look at. And so we can set this to max out on blue, double click, max out the blue value. And then from the RGB, drag that out and type in transform. There we go. And we have a transform vector. And then we want to normalize this with a normalize node. And then we're going to plug this into something called a dot product. Okay. Now in the B slot of the dot product, we can connect our rock or our base texture, whatever you're using for the base texture. You can connect the world aligned normal of the base texture, the XYZ texture, to the B slot of the dot product. And that is now going to connect this texture with the referencing of the blue Z values. And then we can combine that together to figure out the contrast. But we need to now tell the node tree how we're going to figure out that contrast. So first of all, we need to bring in what's called a lerp node or a linear interpolation node. And we're going to plug in the dot product into the alpha. Okay. And we need one more node called the cheap contrast node. And we can plug this into the in slot. Okay. And then plug in the result node of the cheap contrast into the alpha node, alpha slot of our matte layer blend. Okay, and it's beginning to look a little bit like spaghetti junction, but don't worry, we're not going to stay here for long. Now, you see here we have 3 values that have no sort of sliders to change those values, or no set values in the first place. So you've got the A and the B slot of the lerp and the contrast as well. So we need to plug in 3 values. And we're going to be using scalar values for all of these because we already have our material instance made. So we're going to press S and click, and we're going to call the first one min. We're going to call the next one max. And then the last one is going to be called contrast. Okay. And we're going to plug those in to the A, B, and C slots as such. So the min goes into the A, max goes into the B, and the contrast, funnily enough, goes into the contrast slots. So what these are doing are controlling the amount of blending that we're doing between the two materials. So you can see in our preview menu here, we actually have the materials start to show something. And I always have these set values which just sort of make the blend for us. So the min, set that to -5. Set the max to 3.5. And set the contrast to 3.5 as well. And what this does, there you go, is you can now see that it has added this sort of top to the rock textures. And as we change these parameters, it will change the blending of this. Now, this little node tree that we've set up down here actually allows the two materials to blend very, very seamlessly, because it's using the normal sort of the gradient of those two colors, the height values. That's why we set this to blue, to allow us to blend between the two textures. And that is us pretty much done. Now we can come back and change the tiling in just a second, but we can actually now click save. It will probably take a few minutes to think about it, just because it's updating all the material instance. And then when we come back to our environment, we should see that we have these patches of areas where it has started to use the rock textures. Now you can see it looks a bit naff at the moment just because of the tiling. It's not really done a really nice job there. But just to show you how this sort of works, is when we sculpt up a mound, it will start to blend in depending on the gradient of the size of the sides. Rather, it will start to automatically paint in those bits of landscape for you, which is pretty cool. Saves you a lot of time. You can get a really realistic looking landscape very, very quickly. And we can change how these are blending together using our parameter like we did in the previous tutorial. So if I just check all of these boxes and change the contrast, this will change how blended or unblended they are. So you can make it a really harsh line between the two, or you can make it a really sort of smooth transition, but I think 3.5 is normally pretty good. And then if we change the min and max value, this will change how much coverage there is, or how little is covered as well. Okay. Now, this type of material, the auto landscape material, can actually be coupled together with a paintable texture. So it sort of allows you to paint in, so let's say if I wanted to add in a concrete path here, I could have that as a paintable texture that isn't an auto landscape material. But just know, the more nodes you have and the more parameters, the slower it is and more likely it is to crash as well. So just bear that in mind. There is going to be a limit, and there's also a limit to how many textures you can have on one landscape, unless you do this little trick. So if we go back to our material, make this full screen. If on all of your texture samples, not the texture objects, but the texture samples, so we've only got 2. If you come over to the details panel, you see here under sample source, it says from texture asset. Change that to shared wrap and then click save. If you do that for every single texture sample that you have, even on the paintable version of the material, it just allows you to have more than 4 textures on one tile at one time. And it will slow your computer down, obviously, the more texture you've got, because it's loading more things, but it won't just go blank, which is what would happen if we didn't have that on. Okay. Now, we do need to set up the tiling for this. As you can see, we don't have the ability to currently tile the base color and the normal for each of the textures. Now, if you were to drag and drop this, you would get an error. And basically what this error is saying is that it can't take a smaller float 2 to a float 3, because what that's basically saying is that the texture size here is using an X, Y, and Z value, and what we're feeding into it here is actually only an X and Y value. So we're missing a third value. Now you could add in a float 2 to float 3 node and duplicate one of the values. That's absolutely fine if you wanted to do that. But because these are basically the same in the way that they sort of tile, you might not necessarily want to do that because it could create some funky looking textures. Now we do have one sort of problem, because the XYZ coordinate here and the XY coordinate down here, they're not going to work together. There's no sort of easy way to solve this. So there are a few workarounds that we could do. We could tile these separately, so we could have this as a UV by itself, and then use a constant 3 vector to actually tile this one. But you know, it is going to give different values. They're not going to be controllable together, that sort of thing. So one thing that I've found fairly easy to use is just a scalar value for everything. And this makes the scaling the exact same for all of those textures. So just get rid of everything other than the scalar value, and then we can plug those in. And then in theory, this should now allow us to scale everything. Now looking at our sort of example default sphere that we've got here, everything looks a little bit weird, and that is because our scale is just really tiny. So if we set this to 1000 by default, we now have something which looks a little better. So if we save out our material and then just hop back into our world and have a look at the material instance, you can see here that the tiling, if we just revert back to default, which is what these little arrows are for, and revert those back to default, move this to the one side, click save. There we go. So don't know why that happened there, but it just needed checking and unchecking, and then it worked. So you can see here that we can change the size of the leaves. They could be huge, or I think sort of a value of around 500 could work. And then we can change the value of our rocks as well, so that they look a little bit less tiled. Now, we could add in some variation, like a macro variation texture, but that's for another time. But you can see here that we have created our auto landscape material with a nicely tiled sort of ability to tile everything, or to make it look really bad at tiling if you wanted to. Or you can make it really huge and create some really funky looking textures. So this is really just sort of personal interest of how you want to set that up. But we can then also incorporate some of the things from the other video that we were using. So if you wanted to change the color of the grass, then the only thing you have to do is add in a multiply node and a color node. Make sure that you rename this to be grass color. Remember, I can't have things named the same thing. So grass color, set it to white by default, add in your multiply, and then attach that to base color, click save. Now when we go into our material instance, we can change our grass color to whatever we want it to be. So we could find something which is, now sometimes the grass color doesn't work too well. You have to click OK for it to update. So we're just trying to find a green that sort of matches the green of the sort of leaves on the ground, just so it fits a little bit better. There we go, that'll do for now. And then what we have there is an auto landscape material with foliage, with a static mesh on a landscape that we created. Now you can see it's a little bit shiny. So what we could go back and do is change the specular value. That's how we could change that. And to add some variation in, we could add in a macro variation map as well.